Hi, this is Remembering the Past, the show where we talk about people who've died recently who've had a profound effect on our history, our society, or our culture. And in our ongoing series on Nobel Prize winners, tonight we're going to talk about Walter Kohn, who died recently at the age of 93. Although Dr. Kohn was a physicist, he shared the 1998 Nobel Prize in Chemistry with Dr. John Pople for their work on the density functional theory, which described the behavior of electrons. Here is the 1998 presentation of the Nobel Prize to Dr. Kohn.
Professor Kohn, you were rewarded last year's Nobel Prize of Chemistry together with Professor John Pople for your contributions to quantum chemistry. They have been fundamental importance also in the context of this year's Nobel Prize as calculations of energies of structures of the molecules in their various states are of crucial importance for the interpretation of the experiments. On behalf of the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences, may I warmly congratulate you and ask you to come forward to receive the Nobel Prize in Chemistry of 1998 from the hands of His Majesty the King.
Well, normally when I deal with Nobel Prize winners in physics and chemistry and esoteric subjects, I mess up, and then I get comments from physics and chemistry professors from all over the country. But in this case, I'm lucky because Dr. Kohn was an extremely articulate guy, and he's going to explain density functional theory in simple terms.
People who have had a course in chemistry may remember that they've seen pictures in their high school textbooks or in their college textbooks of atoms. Let's take the hydrogen atom, it's the simplest one. And you would expect, if you know a little chemistry, the atom is a nucleus and an electron, and you would expect that the nucleus is pretty small, so it looks like a small sphere, and the electron is a little bigger, but still a very small sphere. So you'd sort of visualize one particle, the nucleus, and another particle, the electron. That's the old picture that goes back to Niels Bohr, and the picture that he had of the hydrogen atom was the nucleus is very heavy, and so it essentially doesn't move, and the electron is a little particle, and it goes around the nucleus pretty much like the Earth goes around the sun, or the moon goes around the Earth. And that was a very good model, and it explained many things in a remarkable way. But it was the beginning. Later, there was a major step forward taken by an Austrian physicist by the name of Schroedinger. His picture was still that the nucleus is pretty much a particle, it doesn't move much, stays put. But the electron, instead of being, again, a particle going around like a planet, was described as a wave going around. That's a little hard to visualize, like a water wave that's going around the nucleus. The picture of a cloud was introduced later, and that's probably what you've seen in your books. You've probably seen a picture of a hydrogen atom as a nucleus in the middle, and then there's an electron cloud spread around it. It's rather dense near the nucleus, and it becomes less and less dense, and the density just fades away. Density functional theory. The density that I'm talking about is the density of this cloud. It used to be thought that this picture of the electrons as a cloud was a very rough and fuzzy description of the reality, of the quantitative reality. And basically what we showed was that we could reformulate the older existing theories, for example, this wave theory of Schrödinger, entirely and completely in terms of this cloud picture, and mathematically speaking, precisely and rigorously. And that was something new, and it opened up a new perspective on the structure of atoms, of molecules, and of solids. The density that occurs in the expression density functional theory is the density of the electrons. Traditional methods have been limited to understanding relatively small structures. They have been phenomenally successful. Density functional theory has broken that barrier, and with density functional theory, some of my friends and colleagues have been able to deal with structures including 100, even up to 1,000 atoms. So that opens up a whole new field of chemistry and physics.
Thank you, Dr. Kohn. Well, Walter Kohn was a nice Jewish boy born in Vienna, so he's part of the great tradition of Austrian physicists, which include Schrödinger, Boltzmann, Pauli, and many others. We'll talk about his early background in a little while, but I wanted to mention that he got his PhD at Harvard under Julian Schwinger, one of the great 20th century physicists, who also won the Nobel Prize and trained 4 Nobel Prize winners, including Dr. Kohn. Dr. Kohn's home base was at the UC Santa Barbara, and I mentioned that even though he was a physicist, he won his Nobel Prize in chemistry. And here he talks about his relationship with chemists and a cute story about what happened to him at Santa Barbara the day after he won the Nobel Prize.
Chemists do use my work extensively, and they appreciate it. And they are, because they appreciate it, they are, without exception, very friendly towards me. They would be in a position extremely easily to embarrass me terribly, but nobody has ever tried that. I can tell you a slightly amusing story. The day after I received the prize, of course, it was quite a sensation in my little town in Santa Barbara. So I walked across the campus, and 2 women students, are walking in the opposite direction. They must have seen my picture somewhere, perhaps in the student newspaper. And so one of them turns around and comes back and says to me, "Are you the guy who won the Nobel Prize?" And I said, "Yes, I am." So they both gave me a very friendly hug. Then they kept going again. But then one came back again and said, "Do you mind? We are just going to a chemistry exam. Can we ask you a question?" I was in a very tight spot. Right? So I said, "Well, try me." And I started praying very hard because I knew that the more elementary the questions would be, the less likely that I could answer them. And so then this one young woman began to ask the question. And then I recognized an interesting fact. You see, the fact that I got the Nobel Prize in chemistry reflects the fact that at a certain theoretical level, chemistry and physics are very close to each other. But also at the lowest level, they're very close to each other. And these girls didn't really know the difference between physics and chemistry. So the question they had for me was, in fact, a physics question. Right. So I gave them a brilliant answer, and they were very impressed.
One of the most fascinating aspects of Dr. Kohn's story is his childhood. He escaped from Austria in a kinder transport, not one of the ones that Nicholas Winton organized. We did his podcast, but another one. And here he talks about his childhood.
I had traumatic experiences in my childhood. The traumatic experiences were related with the so-called Anschluss, the joining of Austria to Germany during the Hitler time in 1938. Before that, looking back at least, I feel I had a generally good childhood. Many people, of course, suffered under the Hitler regime. My family and I suffered like all other people who were in the same situation because of our religion. We were Jewish. The entire family was totally uprooted, destabilized, maltreated. I was thrown out of my school within a day, as I remember. My parents did succeed to help both my sister and myself to emigrate. We both emigrated first to England. Unfortunately, they were unable to emigrate, and they were eventually murdered. Both my sister and I had a wonderful experience in England, a family that we had not ever encountered personally, but that had some business relationship with my father, took us into their home and treated us as family members, and they were absolutely wonderful. My sister eventually returned to Vienna after she married an Austrian another Austrian emigre. I did not ever even think about returning. It was unbearable for me. In retrospect, right, I was threatened with extermination by the Austrians and Germans, but on the other hand, the English regarded me as a potential spy for the Germans. Interned me and thousands of others for close to 2 years. Of course, compared to the horror of the people who had to stay behind, I was fortunate. Now, the loss of my parents was, of course, a disaster.
Here he talks about the influence that brought him to physics.
Perhaps the most influential person was somebody I encountered after the Anschluss in Austria. So I was expelled from my school. The Anschluss was in March. Next September, some of us who had high grades in school were given the opportunity to enter into a reorganized school, which was exclusively for Jewish students and with Jewish teachers. Many of them did not survive. The director was a physicist, and so he directed the school and he taught physics. Then his Latin teacher was arrested and didn't come back, and so the director, who had taken Latin in school, also taught Latin, Ovid and Virgil, and the dictionary. So he taught us from the books and the dictionary. He influenced me both very much as a just admirable personality generally, and inexplicably it was evident to me from the beginning that this man really knew science, really understood science. Then about 10 years later, I found out that he had been an assistant of Einstein. I think without meeting him, and I had another very good teacher, a mathematician in the same school, without these two gentlemen, I probably would not have become a scientist.
You can see the fermenting of European physics during the middle of the 20th century and how Einstein was somehow at the center of it all the time. Well, as we often do with our Nobel Prize winners, we hope to include a little bit of advice that they give to young scientists. Here is some advice from Dr. Kohn.
Be prepared for some great excitement and great personal rewards, but mostly disappointments. And you must last through the disappointments, and you have to be prepared for them.
Walter Kohn, one of the great physics minds of the 20th century, who ironically won his Nobel Prize in chemistry. Well, I'm going to close on that note. I want to thank my producer and IT genius, Sid Tepps. And we're going to close with a brief mention of Billy Paul, who died recently at the age of 81. Billy Paul was a nice African-American boy from Philadelphia who became an R&B singer. His career in Philadelphia started at age 11 when he was encouraged by friend Bill Cosby to sing on a Philadelphia radio station. A little while later, he was drafted into the Army and he served in West Germany in the same unit as Elvis Presley. Another guy in that unit was Gary Crosby, Bing's son. Billy Paul tried to get Elvis to join them to form a jazz trio, but Elvis said he preferred to drive a Jeep. And my guess is he was probably seeing Priscilla a lot too. That took a lot of his time, but what might have been? Anyway, when he got back to Philadelphia, he eventually met Kenny Gamble and Leon Huff. We've talked about Gamble and Huff before, and Billy Paul started singing on a record label they had. He started singing their songs. And in 1972, he hit it big, and to a certain extent, so did Gamble and Huff, because this song helped establish the iconic Gamble and Huff Philadelphia sound. It went to #1 in the country, and unfortunately, Billy Paul never had a hit anywhere close to it, but here it is, Me and Mrs. Jones.
Me and Mrs. Jones, we got a thing going on. We both know that it's wrong, but it's much too strong to let it go now.